The Taken at Gordon Manor, Episode 10, The Hunt. The blue light lingered for a moment that stretched into eternity, filling Georgie's bedchamber with that cold, brilliant radiance that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, pressing against the walls, against the windows, against the very air they breathed. Everyone remained frozen in place, servants and family alike, their faces pale and shocked in that otherworldly glow, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and wonder as they witnessed something that should not exist, something that defied every law of nature and reason they had been taught to believe in. The light pulsed once more, that slow, deliberate rhythm like breathing, like a heartbeat, like something alive watching them with cold curiosity from beyond the veil of their understanding. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The room plunged back into the warm, flickering glow of candlelight and the dying fire in the hearth, the familiar shadows returning to their proper places in the corners and beneath the furniture. But nothing felt the same. The air itself seemed changed, charged with something electric and wrong, and every person in that room knew with absolute certainty that they had just witnessed something that would alter the course of their lives forever. For a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. Everyone just stood there, staring at the windows where the light had been, at each other's pale faces, trying to process what they had seen, trying to find some rational explanation that would make sense of the impossible. Dickie was the first to break the silence, his voice thin and shaking, stripped of all its usual authority and bluster. What was that? Ruth turned to him slowly, her face bloodless, her hand still pressed to her mouth as if to hold back the scream that wanted to escape. When she spoke, her voice was high and tight, with barely controlled hysteria. We all saw it, Father. We all saw it. The light, the blue light, just like Celestina described when she was a child. The light that came to her room, the light that took her. The light, Timothy whispered, and his face was grey in the candlelight, his hands trembling where they gripped Ruth's shoulders. It was just like she said, exactly like she said. All these years we thought it was fever dreams, or a child's imagination, or anything but the truth. But it was real. It's been real all along. And slowly, inevitably, with the terrible weight of dawning understanding, all eyes turned to Celestina. She didn't notice their stares, didn't see the fear and accusation and horrified recognition in their faces. She had pulled free from Manchester's protective embrace and stumbled to the bed, collapsing beside her mother's body with a cry that seemed torn from somewhere deep in her chest, somewhere primal and broken that knew only grief. "Mother," she sobbed, clutching Georgie's cold hand in both of hers, pressing it to her cheek, to her lips, as if her touch could somehow warm the flesh that was already growing stiff and waxy. "Mother, please. Please don't go. Please don't leave me. I love you. I'm so sorry for everything, for not being able to save you, for bringing this curse to our family, for being the reason they came. Mother, please." But Georgie was gone, her eyes staring sightless at the ceiling, her chest still and silent, her hand growing colder with each passing second as the last warmth of life fled from her body. And the blue light had come to witness her passing, had filled the room at the exact moment of her death, as if summoned by it, as if waiting for this precise instant to reveal itself to everyone who had ever doubted, who had ever dismissed Celestina's stories as madness or delusion. Manchester moved to Celestina's side, his hands gentle on her shoulders as he tried to pull her back from the bed, to give her some distance from the terrible finality of death. "Celestina," he murmured, his voice soft with compassion. "She's gone. You need to let her go." But Celestina couldn't let go. couldn't release that cold hand, couldn't accept that her mother was truly gone and that all her desperate efforts, all her midnight pleas to creatures who didn't care, had amounted to nothing but failure and loss. The servants began to back toward the door, their faces reflecting the same superstitious terror that had gripped the village for weeks now. They whispered to each other in voices they thought were too low to hear, but in the terrible silence of that room, every word carried with perfect clarity. The witch child brought them here. The lights came when she called them. She killed the mistress with her dark arts. We're none of us safe while she's in this house. Dickie heard them too, and something in his face shifted, some calculation being made behind his eyes as he looked from the whispering servants to his sobbing daughter to the windows where the impossible light had been. He was trying to make sense of it, trying to fit this into his understanding of the world, trying to find someone to blame because that was what he always did when faced with something beyond his control. But for once, for this one terrible moment, he seemed to have no words, no rage, no accusations to hurl. He just looked old and frightened and utterly lost as he stared at his wife's body and tried to comprehend what it meant that they had all witnessed the same impossible thing at the exact moment of her death. The morning sun had climbed high over the village by the time the well-woman made her way down the narrow lane toward the stone well that sat at the crossroads, her wooden bucket swinging from one hand and her thoughts occupied with the ordinary concerns of her daily routine. She had bread rising at home that would need to be checked soon, and her youngest was feeling poorly with a cough that worried her, and there was mending to be done before her husband returned from the fields. Ordinary thoughts, normal thoughts, the kind of thoughts that filled the days of ordinary women in ordinary villages where nothing strange or terrible ever happened. Except that strange and terrible things had been happening in this village for weeks now, and everyone knew it, even if no one wanted to speak of it openly, even if they all tried to pretend that the blue lights in the sky and the flattened crops and the dead livestock were natural phenomena that had rational explanations. She reached the well and set her bucket on the stone rim, then began to work the rope and pulley that would lower it into the dark water below. The mechanism creaked and groaned with the familiar sounds of age and use, and she found comfort in that familiarity, in the routine of this simple task that she had performed thousands of times before. The bucket splashed into the water far below, and she began to pull it back up, hand over hand, the rope rough against her palms. When the bucket finally emerged from the well's dark mouth, sloshing with cold, clear water, she paused to catch her breath and happened to glance down at the water's surface. Her own reflection looked back at her, distorted and wavering in the moving water. And behind her reflection, bright and unmistakable, was a blue light. She spun around with a gasp, her heart suddenly hammering in her chest, her hands gripping the bucket's handle so tightly that her knuckles went white. Nothing. The lane behind her was empty, the morning sun bright and warm on the stone walls of the cottages, a chicken scratching in the dirt nearby. Everything perfectly normal and ordinary, and exactly as it should be. She turned back to the bucket with a nervous laugh, chiding herself for being foolish, for letting the village gossip and her own imagination get the better of her. And that's when she blinked. Just a simple blink, the kind she had done millions of times in her life without thought or consequence. The momentary closing and opening of her eyes that took less than a heartbeat. But when her eyes opened again, everything had changed. It was night. The sun was gone, replaced by stars that glittered cold and distant in a black sky. The air had turned chill, her breath misting before her face, and frost sparkled on the stone rim of the well. The chicken was gone. The warm light in the cottage windows was gone. Everything was dark and cold and wrong. And she was still standing at the well, still holding the bucket, as if no time had passed at all. Except that time had passed. Hours had passed. The entire day had somehow vanished in the space of a single blink, stolen from her with such completeness that she had no memory of it, No sense of where it had gone or what had happened to her during those missing hours. She looked down at the bucket in her trembling hands and felt fresh horror wash through her. The water was frozen solid, not the thin skin of ice that might form on a bucket left out overnight in winter, but solid ice all the way through, as if the water had been frozen for hours, despite the fact that it was spring, despite the fact that the day had been warm, despite the fact that she had just pulled this bucket from the well moments ago. Except it hadn't been moments ago. Somehow, impossibly, it had been hours ago. She dropped the bucket with a clatter that echoed in the silent night, and that's when she saw her hand. Her right hand, held up before her face in the starlight, bore a mark she had never seen before. A perfect circle of small puncture wounds, each one precise and identical, arranged in a geometric pattern on the back of her hand. The marks were fresh, slightly raised, the skin around them reddened as if from some recent injury, though she felt no pain and had no memory of how they had gotten there. But she had seen marks like these before. Years ago, when she had been one of the servants at Gordon Manor, when she had helped tend to little Celestina Grover, after the child had disappeared one night and been found the next morning wandering in the East Wing with no memory of where she had been. The child had borne marks just like these on her small hand, perfect circles of puncture wounds that the physician couldn't explain and that everyone had whispered about when they thought the family couldn't hear. The witch child had the same marks. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, making her stagger back from the well, her hand pressed to her chest as if she could slow the frantic hammering of her heart. She remembered the gossip from all those years ago, the whispered conversations in the servants' quarters about what might have happened to little Celestina, about the blue lights that some claimed to have seen in the manor that night, about how the child had been different afterward, touched by something dark and wrong. And now she bore the same marks that the witch child had carried, which meant that whatever had taken Celestina all those years ago had taken her too. She turned and ran for home, her breath coming in panicked gasps, her mind reeling with terror and confusion. But even as she ran, even as she tried to convince herself that there had to be some rational explanation, that she must have fallen asleep somehow, that the marks were from some mundane injury she couldn't remember, she knew the truth with cold certainty. The blue light had come for her just as it had come for Celestina Grover. And if it could take her, if it could steal hours from her life and mark her body and leave her standing at a well with no memory of how the day had passed, then it could take anyone. And it was Celestina Grover's fault. She had brought this darkness to the village. She had summoned these things with her witchcraft. And now they were here among them all, taking people, marking them, stealing their time and their memories. Something had to be done. Someone had to make it stop. The morning after Georgie's death dawned cold and grey, the sky heavy with clouds that promised rain but delivered only a damp chill that seeped into bones and spirits alike. The household moved through their tasks with hushed voices and careful steps, the weight of loss and fear pressing down on everyone as they prepared for the funeral that would take place that very afternoon. Georgie's body had been washed and dressed by the women of the household, her hair arranged prettily around her peaceful face, her hands folded on her chest in an attitude of prayer. She looked almost alive in death, as if she were merely sleeping and might wake at any moment, and that illusion made the grief somehow sharper, somehow more unbearable. Celestina had wanted to help with the preparations, had wanted to be there for those final intimate moments with her mother, but Dickie had forbidden it with a firmness that brooked no argument. So she had been left to pace her room while others tended to Georgie, while they dressed her and arranged her and made her ready for the journey that all souls must eventually take. Now she stood at her window looking out at the grey morning, her reflection pale and hollow-eyed in the glass, and tried to make sense of what had happened. The blue light had come. Everyone had seen it. There could be no more denying now. No more dismissing her experiences as delusion or fever dreams. They all knew. And that knowledge terrified her almost as much as the light itself had, because she could see in their faces what they were thinking, could read in their eyes the conclusions they were drawing. If the light came when Celestina called to it, if it appeared at the moment of Georgie's death, then surely Celestina was responsible. Surely she had brought this curse upon them all. Behind her she heard Dickie's voice rising from somewhere downstairs, not in anger this time, but in something worse. A kind of desperate, rambling monologue that he seemed to be having with himself, or with God, or with anyone who might be listening. It was a sign. His voice drifted up through the floorboards, muffled but audible. A sign from the Almighty. An angel's light come to take her soul to heaven. That's what it must have been. God sent his angel to collect her because she was too good for this world, too pure, too innocent. A pause, and then his voice again, quieter now, filled with something that might have been anguish or might have been self-pity. But why would God take her? What did I do to deserve this? I'm not a perfect man, I know that. I have my faults, my sins. I've been prideful. I've been harsh. I've let my temper get the better of me. Is this my punishment? Did God take her because I wasn't worthy of her? Because I failed as a husband? Ruth's voice, soft and soothing, trying to comfort him. Father, please, this isn't your fault. Mother was ill. The physician said... The physician knows nothing, Dickie's voice cracked. He couldn't save her. No one could save her. And that light, that terrible, beautiful light, what was it if not divine judgment? What was it if not God himself looking down upon this house and finding it wanting? Celestina closed her eyes and pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window. Dickie was trying to make sense of what he had seen by fitting it into his understanding of the world, by making it about God and angels and divine judgment instead of accepting the much more terrifying truth. But Celestina knew what the light really was. And she knew that it had nothing to do with God or angels or judgment. It simply was, cold and indifferent and utterly beyond human understanding or control. A soft knock at her door made her turn. Manchester entered without waiting for permission, his face drawn with worry and lack of sleep. We leave after the funeral, he said without preamble, closing the door behind him and crossing the room to take her hands in his. No arguments, no delays. I have the carriage ready. We'll go straight to my estate where you'll be safe. Celestina nodded numbly, unable to find the words to protest, or to argue, or to say anything at all. Her mother was gone. The blue light had come. Everyone had seen it. What else was there to say? I'm sorry, Manchester said softly, pulling her into his arms and holding her close. I'm so sorry about your mother, and I'm sorry that we have to leave so quickly. But Celestina, the village, you haven't seen how they're looking at you. The servants are talking. I heard them this morning when I went down for breakfast. They're frightened, and frightened people do dangerous things. I know, Celestina whispered against his chest. I can feel it. The way they look at me now, like I'm something to be feared. Something to be destroyed. Then you understand why we can't stay. Not even for one more day. After the funeral, we leave immediately. She nodded again, and they stood together in the grey morning light, holding each other against the coming storm that both of them could feel building on the horizon. 3 o'clock in the morning, the darkest hour before dawn. The Reverend Thomas Whitmore jerked awake in his narrow bed, with his heart pounding and his ears ringing with a sound that should not exist at this unholy hour. The church bells were ringing, all of them. Every single bell in the tower, from the great bronze giants that called the faithful to Sunday services, to the smaller bells that mark the hours and the quarter hours, all of them pealing at once in a cacophony that was more chaos than music, more violence than celebration. He threw back his blankets and stumbled to the window, pressing his face to the cold glass and looking out toward the church that sat just across the narrow lane from the vicarage. The building was dark, no light in any of the windows, no sign of who might be pulling the bell ropes at this impossible hour. The Reverend pulled on his coat over his nightshirt and grabbed his lantern, then rushed out into the cold night air, his boots splashing through puddles left by the afternoon's rain. The bells continued their terrible ringing, loud enough to wake the entire village, loud enough to bring people stumbling from their beds in confusion and fear. He reached the church door and found it unlocked, which was his first clue that something was terribly wrong, because he always locked it before retiring for the night, always checked it twice to be certain. He pushed through the heavy oak door and into the nave, his lantern casting wild shadows across the pews and the whitewashed walls. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice barely audible over the ringing of the bells. "Show yourself. What is the meaning of this?" No answer. Just the continued pealing of the bells, that awful, discordant clanging that seemed to shake the very stones of the church. He hurried toward the bell tower, taking the narrow stone stairs 2 at a time, his breath coming hard and his heart hammering with a mixture of anger and growing fear. When he reached the bell chamber, he found the door still locked from the inside, just as he had left it, the heavy iron lock securely fastened. But the bells were ringing, all of them, the ropes swinging wildly despite there being no one to pull them, the heavy bronze bells tolling with such force that he could feel the vibrations through the soles of his feet. "This is not possible," he whispered, backing away from the locked door. "This cannot be." And that's when he saw the light. Blue light, brilliant and cold, filtering through the narrow stained glass window at the end of the nave, the same window that depicted the resurrection of Christ in panels of coloured glass. The blue light turned the reds and golds and purples into something strange and wrong, transforming the sacred image into something that made the Reverend's skin crawl. He turned and fled down the stairs, his earlier anger replaced now by pure instinctual terror. When he burst back into the nave, the bells stopped. Just like that, all at once. The sudden silence was so profound, so absolute, that it was almost painful after the minutes of terrible ringing. The Reverend stood in the middle of the aisle, breathing hard, his lantern shaking in his trembling hand. Dead silence. Not even the usual creaking of old wood or the whisper of wind through the eaves. Just absolute, perfect stillness. He walked slowly toward the altar, his footsteps echoing in the empty church. The blue light was gone now, the stained glass windows showing only the faint grey of pre-dawn light. The Reverend stood there in the cold morning air, his breathing coming in short, panicked gasps. He had spent his entire life in service to God, had devoted himself to the church and to the spiritual care of his flock, had always believed that faith would protect him from the darkness of the world. But this was something his faith had no name for, no defense against. This was something old and terrible and utterly beyond his understanding. And it had marked his church, had violated his sacred space, had rung his bells in the darkest hour of night. The blue light had been here, the same blue light that people whispered about when they thought he wasn't listening. The same light that had been seen near Gordon Manor. The same light that had appeared, according to the servants' gossip that had reached even his ears, at the exact moment of Georgiana Grover's death. And it had come to his church in the darkest hour of night and rung his bells and left its mark where all could see it. A message, a warning, a sign of something that the Reverend was very much afraid he did not want to understand. The funeral was held in the small chapel at Gordon Manor rather than in the village church, a decision that Dickie had made over the Reverend's weak protests, claiming that the family needed privacy in their grief, and that Georgie would have wanted a quiet, intimate service attended only by those who truly loved her. But the real reason, though no one spoke it aloud, was that Dickie was afraid of bringing Celestina into the village, afraid of what the villagers might do if they saw her, if they connected the death of Georgiana Grover with the strange events that had been plaguing them all. So they gathered in the manor's chapel, a handful of mourners in a space meant for many more. The family sat in the front pew, Dickie looking old and haggard, Ruth and Timothy beside him, and Celestina and Manchester at the far end, slightly separated from the others as if the family itself could not quite decide whether to include them or push them away. Behind them, scattered across the other pews, were a few servants who had loved Georgie, a neighbour or two who could not be avoided without causing offence, and then, entering late and causing a stir when they did, several of the villagers who had no particular connection to the family, but who had come for reasons that became clear as the service progressed. Higgins slipped into a pew near the back, his face grim and his clothes still bearing the dirt from his morning's work in the fields. Behind him came Inus and his younger brother, both of them farm labourers who worked Higgins' land, their faces equally troubled. The blacksmith Thomas Wright came next, his clothes hastily donned and his hair uncombed, as if he had come straight from his forge or his bed. And then the woman from the well, her face pale and her right hand wrapped in a cloth to hide the marks that everyone would recognise if they saw them. The Reverend Whitmore stood at the front of the chapel, his prayer book open before him, though he barely glanced at it as he began the service. His voice was steady enough as he spoke the familiar words of the funeral liturgy, but there was something strained about him, something frightened in the way his eyes kept darting to the windows, as if expecting to see that terrible blue light filtering through the stained glass at any moment. We are gathered here today to commend the soul of Georgiana Elizabeth Grover to the mercy of Almighty God, and to commit her body to the earth. His words washed over the congregation, familiar and comforting in their ancient rhythm, but beneath that comfort there was tension, a crackling energy that seemed to fill the chapel, like the feeling in the air before a thunderstorm. Celestina could feel it, could sense the way the villagers were looking at her, could hear the whispers that were barely suppressed even in the solemnity of the funeral service. "For dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return." The Reverend's voice droned on, but behind him, Inus leaned forward to whisper urgently to his brother, gesturing toward Celestina with barely concealed anger. The blacksmith, Thomas Wright, shifted in his seat and raised his sleeve to show something on his arm to those around him, some mark that made eyes go wide. The woman from the well leaned in to see what they were discussing, and when Thomas showed her his arm, she gasped and unwrapped the cloth from her own hand, holding it up so they could see the matching marks. The whispers grew louder. Higgins turned in his seat, his voice low but firm as he tried to quiet them. "Show respect for the dead," he hissed. "This is neither the time nor the place." But Inus was beyond caring about propriety, his grief over his dead cattle and ruined crops boiling over into rage. "How long are we meant to suffer in silence?" he whispered back, though his whisper was loud enough to carry. "How long before we speak the truth?" The Reverend tried to continue, tried to maintain the dignity and solemnity of the service, but his voice was faltering now, his hands shaking where they gripped the edges of his prayer book. "In the sure and certain hope of the resurrection to eternal life." "The lights!" Inus suddenly called out, standing up despite Higgins grabbing at his sleeve to pull him back down. "We all saw them. At the manor, the night she died." Higgins stood as well, his face flushed with anger, but his anger was directed at the disruption, at the loss of order, not at Celestina herself. "Sit down," he growled at Inus. "This is a funeral. Have you no decency?" But the dam had broken, and other voices joined in, emboldened by Inus's outburst. The woman from the well cried out, "My cattle! Dead in a devil's circle, and look!" She held up her marked hand. the same marks the child had. Thomas Wright stood, holding up his arm to display the triangular bruises. 4 hours of my life gone. 4 hours I can't account for, and these marks left behind like brands. Higgins turned to face the crowd, his voice rising to be heard over the growing chaos. Enough! We don't know what caused these things. We don't know. We know she's at the center of it, Enos shouted, pointing directly at Celestina. Everything started with her. The lights follow her. That doesn't mean... Higgins began, but he was drowned out by the crowd's mounting fury. It's the witch! Someone screamed, and suddenly all eyes were on Celestina, all fingers pointing at her, all voices united in accusation. She brought them here. She cursed us with her dark arts. She killed her own mother. Witch, witch, witch. The chant began to build, growing louder with each repetition, and Celestina felt Manchester's hand grip her arm, felt him pulling her to her feet even as Dickie stood and tried to shout over the crowd. Higgins was still trying to restore order, his voice hoarse as he shouted, "Stop this! We need to think clearly! We need to!" But rational thought had no place here, not anymore. The mob had found its target, and no amount of reason could hold them back now. This is unseemly. This is a funeral. Have you no respect for the dead? But his authority meant nothing now. His status as Lord of the Manor meaningless in the face of the villagers' collective fear and rage. They had seen things they couldn't explain, suffered losses they couldn't accept, and they needed someone to blame, needed someone to punish, needed to believe that if they could just remove the source of the darkness, then everything would return to normal. And Celestina was right there, the obvious target, the witch child who had always been different, always been touched by something wrong. Now! Manchester hissed in her ear, and then they were moving, rushing toward the side door of the chapel even as the mob surged forward, hands reaching for them, voices screaming accusations and threats. Dickie tried to block their path, tried to grab Celestina's other arm, but Manchester shoved him aside with more force than was strictly necessary. And then they were through the door and out into the cold afternoon air. Behind them, chaos erupted in the chapel as the mob poured after them, no longer caring about the funeral or the body lying in state or any pretense of respectability and decorum. They wanted the witch, they wanted justice, they wanted blood, and they were coming. They ran. Celestina had never run so hard in her life, her skirts tangling around her legs, her breath coming in desperate gasps, Manchester's hand tight around her wrist as he pulled her along behind him. Behind them, the mob gave chase, their voices raised in terrible anger, their footsteps thundering across the grounds. "This way!" Manchester shouted, veering left toward the old hay barn that sat at the edge of the property, the building half hidden by overgrown hedges and ancient oak trees. They burst through the barn door, and Manchester slammed it shut behind them, his eyes wild as he looked around for something to bar it with. He grabbed a length of timber and shoved it through the iron brackets, then turned to Celestina and pointed up at the loft. "Up! Quickly!" She climbed the ladder with Manchester close behind her. And then they were huddled in the hayloft, pressed against the back wall where they couldn't be seen from below, their breathing harsh and loud in the close darkness. Below they could hear the mob searching, spreading out across the grounds, calling to each other as they hunted. "Check the stables!" She might have gone toward the woods. "Find her! Find the witch!" Footsteps approached the barn, and both Manchester and Celestina froze, not daring even to breathe. The door rattled as someone tried to open it, then cursed when they found it barred from the inside. "She's in here! The door's been barred!" More footsteps, voices conferring in urgent whispers just outside. "We'll need an axe to break through." "No, there's another way, around the back, a loading door." Manchester pulled Celestina deeper into the shadows, his arms wrapping around her protectively, his lips pressed to her ear. "Don't move," he breathed. so quietly it was barely sound at all. "Don't make a sound, no matter what happens." She nodded against his shoulder, her whole body shaking with terror and exhaustion, and the awful knowledge that the people hunting her were not strangers, not invaders from some foreign land, but her own neighbors, people she had known her whole life, people who had once smiled at her in the village street and wished her good morning. Now they wanted her dead. Below, they heard the creak of the back door opening, heard footsteps entering the barn, heard someone call out, "Search every corner, she has to be here somewhere." And then, from above them, from outside, from everywhere and nowhere all at once, came the light. Blue light flooded the barn, brilliant and cold, pouring through every crack in the walls, every gap in the roof, filling the space with that terrible radiance that Celestina had seen so many times before, but that never ceased to terrify her. The mob stopped, just stopped, mid-step, mid-breath, mid-shout. The sudden silence was so complete that Celestina could hear her own heartbeat, could hear Manchester's breathing beside her, could hear nothing else at all from below, where seconds ago there had been voices and footsteps and rage. The light grew brighter, pulsing with that slow, deliberate rhythm that suggested something alive, something aware, something watching them all with cold and terrible interest. And beneath that light, a sound began to build. Low at first, barely perceptible, but growing steadily louder with each passing second. A humming, not mechanical, not quite musical, something in between, a sound that seemed to resonate in the bones and teeth and skull, that vibrated through the body in a way that was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Manchester's arms tightened around Celestina until she could barely breathe, and she could feel him trembling, could feel the terror that matched her own. The humming grew louder, louder, until it was all there was, filling the world, filling her mind, filling every space where thought or fear or hope might exist. And in that terrible sound, in that blue light, in that frozen moment when the mob and the hunted alike became prey to something far older and stranger than any of them could comprehend. To be continued.